I was thrown out of the restaurant as if I were invisible, not even given the chance to sit at the table, simply because I'm black. They shattered what I once believed was a normal life and thought I would just disappear. But what happened next sparked a wave of change that no one could have predicted, least of all those who were used to looking down on others. My next move will surprise even those who have seen a lot in life. But let's start from the very beginning. James, exhausted after an especially grueling week at work, longed for a quiet and peaceful evening. He was an experienced IT specialist, working for a large company, which seemed to guarantee him stability and recognition. Yet, none of that could suppress the accumulated fatigue. The last few days had been particularly tough. Deadlines at work, new projects, and meetings that drained all his energy. James felt he deserved a little reward for all his hard work. An evening at a trendy restaurant, where they served his favorite dish, a perfectly grilled steak and exquisite desserts, seemed like the ideal way to end the week. Dusk had already started to settle as he finally parked his car near the restaurant. Looking around, James reassured himself that he had chosen the right place. Calm surroundings and the restaurant's sophisticated ambiance promised a relaxing evening. As soon as he stepped inside, he noticed a few vacant tables, beckoning with the promise of a cozy corner away from the noisy crowds. However, as James approached the hostess stand, a manager, tall, middle-aged, with a cold, almost frozen expression, walked over to him. The man sized James up from head to toe before speaking. This glance struck James as odd, but he didn't give it much thought, still expecting a warm welcome. "Sorry, but we don't have any tables available for you," the manager said curtly, not even glancing at the electronic reservation list. James froze for a moment, staring in disbelief at the empty tables in the room. There were several of them. Perfect, unoccupied, ready for guests. He wondered if this was some kind of mistake. Were the tables reserved? Or maybe the manager hadn't realized that he hadn't made a reservation. "But there are a few empty tables. I can wait if necessary," James said softly and politely, hoping the situation would resolve itself. However, the manager remained unmoved. His cold eyes showed no attempt to hide his disdain. He repeated, now in an even more detached tone, "There are no tables available for you." At that moment, James noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A few patrons seated at distant tables were throwing mocking glances his way. He saw one whisper something to their companion, and both began to chuckle quietly, their eyes lingering on him. James felt heat rise to his face. This was not a mistake. It was a cold, biased refusal based not on rules or a fully booked restaurant, but on something far deeper and far uglier. Humiliation and anger started to well up inside him. His heart pounded faster, his breathing grew heavy. He could have caused a scene right there, demanded respect, angrily pointed out the empty tables. He could have called the police, or at least threatened to lodge a complaint. But James instinctively suppressed these emotions. He didn't want to give those already watching him with smirks the satisfaction of seeing him lose it. These people, hiding behind their blank stares and quiet whispers, were waiting for him to explode, so they could later tell stories about that unhinged man. His hands trembled with barely controlled anger. He struggled against the urge to slam his fist on the counter or shout something in response. Instead, James took a few deep breaths, trying to regain his composure. He was acutely aware that every step he took was being watched. Calmly turning, he headed toward the exit. The room was silent. People were clearly observing his every move. When he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, slightly cooling his fiery emotions. He stood at the restaurant's entrance, clenching his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes were fixed on the glittering sign above the door, which suddenly seemed to him a symbol of hypocrisy. There were indeed no tables available, not because of a lack of space, but because of a lack of basic respect. Standing there in the twilight, James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The injustice he had just encountered wasn't the first in his life, but each time it left a painful mark. This time, however, something had shifted. He couldn't just walk away and forget about it. A resolve began to boil inside him. He knew he had to act. James promised himself that this incident would not go unnoticed. What had happened here tonight was just the beginning of something much bigger. James returned home, immersed in heavy thoughts. It seemed to him that the cold treatment he had faced at the restaurant shouldn't have affected him so deeply. He had encountered injustice and discrimination before, but each time it felt as though another layer of pain and frustration was added to his soul. Tonight's experience was especially painful. He just wanted to relax, but instead he was met with cold rejection and contempt. James replayed the events over and over in his mind, feeling a growing sense of injustice. As he walked into the house, he was greeted by the cozy aroma of home-cooked food. His wife, Sarah, was already setting the table, while the kids were in the living room, waiting for dinner. Home had always been a place where James could shed his stress, forget about his problems, and feel the support of his closest loved ones. But tonight, his troubling thoughts lingered. Sarah immediately noticed something was wrong with her husband. She saw in his eyes that James was upset, but didn't rush him with questions. James took off his coat and slowly sat down at the table, still boiling with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. He saw his family waiting, and after taking a deep breath, he began to explain what had happened. "Today, I went to that restaurant. You know, the one I've been talking about all week," he began, addressing Sarah, then slowly recounting the details of his experience. His voice was calm at first, but as he described the rejection and the mockery at the restaurant, emotions began to break through. His eldest daughter, Monica, listened intently, barely containing her indignation. She was always the one to fight for justice, and her blog on social media had become a platform for her activism. When James finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Sarah looked at her husband with sadness and empathy, her eyes filled with bitterness at the thought of what he had endured. Monica couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Dad, you can't just let this go," she exclaimed, slapping her hand on the table. "Something has to be done. You need to tell everyone about this. People need to know." James looked at her with some doubt. He didn't want to be the center of attention or cause a scandal. He had always been the kind of person who preferred peace, avoiding conflicts. And drawing attention to something like this often turned into more than he could control. "Monica, I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. It could become something bigger than just a social media post, and I don't want this to fuel any hatred." James spoke calmly, but there was a deep internal struggle in his voice. Monica, however, wasn't backing down. She knew that silence was one of the reasons discrimination persisted. If people didn't speak out, nothing would change. "Dad, I understand your point of view, but you need to realize that if we do nothing, this will keep happening. Not just to you, but to others as well. You're not alone in this. I can help you write about it. We'll tell the story without any hate. Just show what it's like and call for respect. This could help a lot of people." Sarah, who had been quiet until now, took James's hand, her gaze filled with love and support. "She's right," she said softly. "You've always taught us to be strong and to stand up for justice. We're all here for you. If you decide to share your story, we'll be with you every step of the way." James took a deep breath. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but Monica's and Sarah's words sparked new thoughts within him. He recalled how he felt when he left the restaurant, defeated, humiliated, and powerless. Maybe if he shared his story, it wouldn't just help him, but also others who faced similar injustices. After all, if no one spoke up, nothing would change. His younger son, Thomas, who had been sitting quietly until now, suddenly spoke. "Dad, we're all proud of you. You've always taught us to be honest and to stand up for those in need. Now it's time for you to stand up for yourself." These words touched James deeply. In his children's eyes, he saw not only support, but also belief that his story could make a difference. He could no longer stay silent. Slowly, a realization dawned on him that this was more than just a personal insult. This was a challenge to a system that allowed discrimination to continue. "All right," James finally said, nodding. "We'll do it, but I want it to be done right. No accusations, no insults, just an honest story about what happened and a call for respect." Monica smiled for the first time that evening and immediately pulled out her phone to start drafting the post. "Don't worry, Dad. We'll do it right. People need to know the truth. The family continued discussing how to present the story properly, avoiding unnecessary negativity and bringing attention to the issue fairly and objectively. James felt his anger and disappointment slowly being replaced by determination and resolve. He wasn't alone. His family stood behind him, and together they could make a difference. When James woke up in the morning, he felt a mixture of excitement and slight anxiety about the day ahead. Overnight, Monica had posted a detailed account of what had happened at the restaurant, and James was anxious about how people would react. However, he knew that he had made the right decision in choosing not to stay silent. The post had been written with great care. No insults, no accusations, just an honest description of the events, with an emphasis on the importance of fighting discrimination. As promised, Monica had included several hashtags calling for respect and equality. As James entered the kitchen, he saw Monica sitting at the table with her phone in hand, staring tensely at the screen. A wave of unease washed over him, unsure of what to expect. "How did it go?" James asked quietly, bracing himself for the possible outcome. Monica looked up at him and smiled broadly. "Dad, it's incredible. People are really responding. The post has already gotten over 1,000 likes in just a few hours, and the comments keep coming in." James sat down next to her and took the phone to see for himself. The screen was flooded with notifications, messages of support, reposts, and responses. He began reading the comments one by one, and with each new message, a warmth grew in his chest. People were writing words of solidarity, sharing their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. "Stay strong, James. We're all with you. It's awful that things like this still happen. Thank you for speaking out. I went through something similar last year. I fully support you." Many of the comments moved James deeply. He suddenly realized that his story was not just a personal tragedy. It had become a catalyst for all those who had ever experienced discrimination, injustice, or humiliation. Their voices, united through his experience, had become something much larger. Monica continued to tell him how the post was gaining traction. "And that's not all, Dad. People are already suggesting organizing a protest in front of the restaurant. I've seen several comments proposing that. This is really getting attention." As he listened to his daughter, James felt a mixture of pride and concern. He hadn't expected his story to spark such a wave of responses. This was more than just a post. It had become a movement, bringing people together. Comments and reposts were coming not only from those who knew James personally, but also from complete strangers. They were sharing his post, tagging friends and family, creating a vast network of responses that continued to grow by the minute. Meanwhile, the post had started catching the attention of local bloggers and activists. A few of them had picked up the story and shared it on their own platforms, adding their thoughts on the importance of fighting bias. This brought even more visibility to the situation. Monica kept refreshing the feed and reading comments aloud. "Look at this one, Dad. This person says they've been to the same restaurant and saw similar treatment of others. They're calling for a boycott." James frowned, not expecting things to go this far. He didn't want the situation to escalate into aggression or provocation. His goal was to raise awareness of the issue, not incite hatred. "I don't want this to turn into a scandal or fuel hostility," James said, his voice filled with concern. "This shouldn't be a reason for anger or hatred." Monica nodded. "I understand, Dad, but people see in your story something they've experienced themselves. This isn't just about you. It's about the fact that these kinds of things happen everywhere. And if no one talks about it, nothing will change." James pondered for a moment. He knew that his story was just a small part of a much larger issue. It wasn't just about his personal experience, but about the reality faced by thousands of people who encounter similar discrimination daily. And although he feared the potential for conflict, he began to realize that staying silent wasn't the solution. This moment was an opportunity to change something important, to shine a light on systemic injustice, and maybe even provoke change. Soon, James's phone started ringing. Calls were coming in from friends, colleagues, and even a few journalists who wanted to hear his side of the story, and find out what would happen next. James suddenly found himself in the spotlight, a place he had never asked to be. He had to answer questions, share his thoughts, and clarify his intentions. It was a new experience for him. He was used to solving problems quietly, without public attention. Now, his voice was louder than ever before. By evening, as the story continued to spread, James began receiving messages from local civil rights organizations. They offered to help him file a formal complaint against the restaurant, or even organize a public statement. James was surprised that his case had become a point of connection for so many people and organizations willing to support him in this fight. But the most important realization for James was that his story wasn't an isolated incident. He received messages from people all over the country and even beyond. They shared their own stories, recounting similar situations they had faced. These stories were filled with pain, but also with hope that thanks to his example, they might find the strength to speak out against injustice. Each comment, each story, reaffirmed to him that he had made the right decision in sharing his experience. By the end of the day, James sat in his study, away from the buzz and attention that had suddenly surrounded him. He understood now that his case was part of something much larger. He wasn't alone in his fight. His story had opened the eyes of many, and now he felt that this was only the beginning. Several days had passed since James's story went viral on social media. He hadn't anticipated such a powerful response. Support was pouring in from everywhere. Friends, colleagues, strangers, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years. Monica's post not only sparked conversations about James's personal experience, but also ignited a wider discussion on the issue of discrimination faced by many. However, the most unexpected development came from the local media. At first, it was small articles in local news outlets, but soon the story gained momentum, and it was being discussed on television and radio shows. Journalists were eager to interview James, but he hesitated, reluctant to become the public face of this movement. He understood that his personal story had now moved beyond the internet and was being discussed on a broader level. Amid this growing attention, local human rights organizations and activists decided that the time had come to hold a public meeting to discuss discrimination and show their support for James. The event received extensive coverage in the press and on social media, with community leaders actively encouraging people to attend. One evening, as James sat at home with his family, the phone rang. It was the event's organizer, a well-known activist and lawyer who had been fighting against discrimination for years. He invited James to speak at the gathering and share his story in person. The offer took James by surprise. On the one hand, he understood the importance of the event, but on the other, he had always been a modest man, unaccustomed to speaking in front of large crowds. "You have to do this, Dad," Monica said gently but firmly when James expressed his doubts over dinner. "You've already opened the door for change. People want to hear you. They see you as a symbol of the fight against injustice. You can do this, and we'll be with you." Sarah, echoing her daughter's sentiment, added, "We're so proud of you, James. You've given a voice to those who didn't have one. Now you have the chance to do something even bigger." James thought about it. He realized that this moment could be a turning point, not only for him, but for many others who had faced similar discrimination. He recalled how he had felt in the restaurant, angry, humiliated, powerless. Now he had a chance to turn that experience into something positive. After taking a deep breath, he made his decision. He would speak. The day of the meeting arrived. The hall where the event was held was packed. Though it wasn't a large venue, every corner was filled with people who had come to support James and discuss the issue of discrimination. Among those present were community members, local activists, human rights advocates, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by James's story. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a sense of anticipation and hope, a feeling that something important was about to happen. James stood backstage, nervously fidgeting with his hands. The nervousness he had felt earlier was now overwhelming. His mind raced with thoughts about what to say, how to convey his feelings. What if I say something wrong? What if my story isn't strong enough? He wondered. But then he saw Monica, who approached him and gave him a hug, whispering, "You've got this. This is your moment." When the organizer called him to the stage, James took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room fell silent instantly. He stood before hundreds of eyes, all looking at him with expectation. For the first few seconds, his voice trembled as he began to tell his story. His heart pounded in his chest, and each word felt like a struggle. But then he looked at the faces in the audience. He saw support and empathy in their eyes. These weren't the cold, mocking stares he had faced at the restaurant. These were people who believed in him, in his story, and who were waiting for his words with genuine interest. "I never thought that a simple visit to a restaurant could turn my life upside down," he began. "But after what happened, I realized that this issue isn't just about me. It's about everyone who faces injustice. Today, I'm here not just for myself, but for all those who can't speak about what troubles them. We all deserve respect, and we all have to fight for it." With each sentence, James's confidence grew. He spoke about his experience at the restaurant, how he had felt humiliated and powerless, but also how the support from his family and the community had helped him realize his strength. He saw people in the audience nodding in agreement, heard them whispering to each other, sharing his emotions. "This wasn't an isolated incident," James continued. "This is the reality for many people we encounter every day. But we can't stay silent. We must talk about these things, because that's the only way we'll create change." When James finished, the room erupted in applause. People stood up from their seats, expressing their support. It was a moment James would never forget. He felt an incredible sense of relief and pride. For the first time in his life, he understood that his voice mattered. His story had inspired people, and now they were ready to stand with him and fight for justice. After his speech, many people came up to him. Activists, community leaders, ordinary citizens. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, thank him for his courage, and share their own experiences. James felt an overwhelming wave of solidarity and understanding. He no longer felt alone in his fight. This day marked a turning point in his life. He realized that his voice could be a tool for change, and that people were ready to unite to fight injustice. From this moment on, James knew that his struggle for justice was only beginning, and that he was no longer alone. A whole community stood behind him, ready to support him on this journey. Several days after James's public speech, his life was filled with unexpected events and meetings. His story continued to gain momentum, attracting the attention not only of local residents, but also of major media outlets. Each day brought new messages of support, along with interview requests and meetings. But one of the most surprising developments was a phone call from the owner of the restaurant franchise where the incident had occurred. The owner was an experienced businessman who had built a successful chain of restaurants. He was shocked and dismayed that one of his establishments had become the center of a discrimination scandal. James's story had reached him through various channels, from the media to social networks, and each new review about the restaurant was a blow to the business's reputation. Realizing that the situation required immediate attention, the owner decided to reach out to James directly. James was surprised when he received a call from the franchise owner's office. A polite secretary explained that the restaurant owner wanted to meet with him personally to discuss the situation and find a resolution. This proposal made James think. On one hand, he wanted justice and hoped that the meeting would lead to positive change. On the other, he wasn't sure what to expect. Was this just a formal attempt to smooth things over, or was the owner genuinely interested in addressing the problem? After some deliberation, James accepted the offer. He understood that this could be an important step toward preventing similar incidents in the future. They agreed to meet in a neutral location, a small cafe in the city center. The place was chosen specifically to avoid unnecessary media attention or restaurant patrons who might disrupt a serious conversation. On the day of the meeting, James felt a slight nervousness. He knew that this wasn't just a conversation with a businessman. It was a chance to influence not only the restaurant chain, but potentially corporate policy moving forward. Sitting in the cafe, he waited for the owner to arrive, mentally preparing what to say to ensure his voice was heard. He wanted his story to result not just in an apology, but in concrete actions. Finally, the franchise owner walked into the cafe. He was a middle-aged man with a confident stride, but his face reflected seriousness and clear concern. He approached James immediately, gave him a firm handshake, and introduced himself. His expression was sincere. It was obvious that he was troubled by what had happened. "James, I want to say right away that I am shocked and deeply upset by what occurred at one of my restaurants," the owner began. "I've always strived to build a business based on respect for every customer, and this situation is a direct violation of all our principles. I'm here to personally understand the details and do everything in my power to ensure that this never happens again." James listened carefully, noting that the owner seemed genuinely committed to resolving the issue. After brief introductions, they dove into the conversation. The owner wanted to hear James's account of the incident firsthand, even though he was already familiar with the version that had circulated on social media. Despite his nerves, James calmly and thoroughly recounted that evening. He described how he had been refused service without any reason, how the restaurant staff and manager had disrespected him, and how other patrons had supported the behavior. He explained that for him, the incident wasn't just a random mistake. It was a sign that the problem ran deeper than it appeared. When James finished, the owner nodded thoughtfully. "I can't justify my staff's actions," he said. "It's unacceptable, and I intend to conduct a thorough investigation. We've already started taking measures, and in the coming days, I plan to conduct training sessions for all employees across the network. We can't allow this kind of culture to exist in our business. It's important to me not just to apologize to you, but to take real steps to make sure this never happens again." These words gave James hope. He could see that the owner was ready to take action. It wasn't just about an apology. It was about real change in company policy. With the support of his family and the community, James wanted to ensure that his story became a turning point in addressing everyday discrimination. "I appreciate your apology," James said, "but I'm not here just for myself. I want this incident to be a lesson for your company. I want your restaurants to be places where everyone feels respected, regardless of their skin color, background, or social status." The owner agreed and invited James to be involved in the process of implementing changes. He promised that in a week, they would return to the same restaurant together to see the changes that had been made and publicly announce the measures that had been implemented. James appreciated this step, understanding that it would be an important symbolic moment, not only for him, but also for the entire community following this story. The conversation continued for more than an hour. The owner outlined his plans to conduct an internal investigation, dismiss the manager involved, and introduce mandatory training for staff focused on combating bias and discrimination. He also proposed working with James in the future to help develop and implement changes in corporate culture. By the end of the meeting, James felt a sense of relief and hope. He realized that his voice had been heard and that his story had sparked real change. There was still a lot of work ahead, but the first step had been taken. The restaurant owner promised not just to rectify the situation, but to do everything possible to prevent such incidents from happening again in his chain of restaurants. This was more than just a meeting. It was a pivotal moment when James felt that his fight for justice was yielding tangible results. The meeting with the franchise owner was scheduled just a few days after their initial conversation. During that time, James had carefully prepared, considering every detail of the upcoming discussion. He knew that this meeting was a critical moment, one that could not only impact his personal situation, but also influence the behavior and policies of the company in the future. James understood that mere apologies wouldn't be enough, and his goal was to achieve real, lasting changes in the restaurant's policies. On the day of the meeting, James arrived at the designated cafe with his wife, Sarah. She had insisted on coming with him, believing that her presence would give James confidence, and her support would be crucial in this pivotal moment. James knew that this wasn't just his battle. His family had also felt the pain and injustice of what had happened to him. This incident had affected all of them, and they were united in their determination to set things right. The franchise owner arrived promptly at the agreed time. He was dressed in a business suit, his face serious and focused. This was a man who had built a successful business, and was used to being in control of his surroundings. But this time, he was in the role of someone who needed to listen, not command. James could sense that this wouldn't be just a formal meeting, but an earnest conversation, where the owner was ready to take responsibility. The owner warmly greeted James and Sarah, expressing his regret over what had happened. As soon as they sat down at the table, he got straight to the point, not hiding his concern. "James, Sarah, I want to start by saying that I am sincerely sorry for the behavior your husband and father encountered in my restaurant. It is absolutely unacceptable and does not reflect the values on which we build our business. We have always strived to create an atmosphere of respect and hospitality for all our customers, and what happened is a serious signal that something went wrong. I deeply apologize." James listened attentively, his expression serious. Apologies were an important first step, but for him, the next steps were far more important. "I appreciate your words," James began, gathering his thoughts. "But I'm not here just for apologies. I understand that people make mistakes, and incidents like this can happen. But we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. Your restaurant is part of a large business that impacts hundreds, if not thousands of people. I want this to be a lesson, not just for this particular location, but for the entire chain." The owner nodded, acknowledging the gravity of James's words. He knew that a simple apology speech wouldn't suffice. "You're absolutely right," the owner replied. "We've already begun an internal investigation, and I want to assure you that we will take real steps. First, the manager who refused to serve you will be dismissed. I cannot allow people like that to work in my business. Second, we're launching a mandatory training program for all our employees on diversity, inclusion, and respect. This training will include anti-discrimination policies to ensure that every employee understands the importance of treating every customer with respect." James felt that the conversation was moving in the right direction. However, he wanted more than just systemic changes. He wanted public acknowledgement of the problem, which many others had also faced. "These measures are important," James continued. "But how do you plan to convince the public that this isn't just an attempt to smooth over a scandal, but real change? Your customers want to see honesty and transparency. You need to be open in your actions." Sarah, who had been quiet until this point, added, "A lot of people are watching this situation. They want to see that you're willing not only to apologize, but to change the rules of the game. What will you do to prove your commitment to these changes?" The owner, understanding that James and Sarah's questions deserved concrete answers, paused, considering their words carefully. Then he made an offer that surprised James. "I propose that in a week we return to the same restaurant together. We'll have a meeting with the staff and publicly announce the measures we're taking. This won't be just a closed investigation. I want you and everyone who supported you to see that we're taking steps forward. I'm prepared to do this publicly." This offer was unexpected but important to James. He hadn't anticipated that the owner would be willing to take such an open step. Yet this was an opportunity, not just for him but for the entire community that had supported him in this fight. "I agree," James said after a brief pause. "I want people to see that these aren't just words but real actions." The meeting continued as they discussed the details of the upcoming joint meeting with the restaurant staff. The owner also suggested that James participate in the development of training programs for the employees, ensuring that the training wouldn't be just formal, but would include real-life examples. This suggestion brought a smile to James's face. His story had not only been heard, but had become a catalyst for change. When the meeting concluded, James felt that this was a significant step forward. It wasn't just an apology meeting. It was a dialogue in which both sides were striving for real change. As James and Sarah left the cafe, he felt a sense of relief, but also knew that this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, and he understood that now he had the support not only of his family, but of an entire community of people who believed in his story and fought alongside him. He knew the battle had only just begun, but this step gave him the confidence that change was possible if fought for with determination and the backing of those who shared these values. The week leading up to James's return to the restaurant was filled with intense and dynamic work. After his meeting with the franchise owner, they developed a detailed action plan, which included not just apologies, but real steps toward changing the company's culture. James knew that this phase was incredibly important, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been affected by discrimination in their daily lives. He took on the role of a mediator between the community and the business, working to bring about meaningful change. The first step was to create a comprehensive training program for the restaurant employees. The franchise owner acknowledged that incidents like this indicated deep-rooted problems that needed to be addressed at a systemic level. It was decided that all employees, from managers to waitstaff, would undergo specialized training on inclusivity, equality, and respect. James was actively involved in this process, helping to develop the materials for the training sessions. Every day, James met with the owner and a team of specialists to discuss the content of the training program. They decided to create a series of video modules that would illustrate real examples of discrimination, its consequences, and most importantly, how to respond to such situations appropriately. For James, it was essential that the training go beyond formalities and touch on the emotional aspects of discrimination, how it affects people's lives, their self-esteem, and their mental health. One of the key elements of the program was James's personal contribution. He recorded a video message in which he shared his story, emphasizing that discrimination is not just an isolated incident, but a deep wound that can leave a lasting impact. James didn't just list the facts, he spoke from the heart about his pain, anger, and disappointment. But he also spoke of hope and the importance of standing up for one's rights without giving up. Recording the video was an emotional experience for James. He knew that his words would be heard by many, not only the restaurant employees, but also a wider audience online. His voice was meant to represent more than just a disgruntled customer. It was a symbol of the possibility for change if people are willing to fight for it. When the video was posted on social media, it quickly gained traction. Monica, his daughter, helped promote it through her blog and activist networks. James's video went viral. People shared it, left supportive comments, and told their own stories of discrimination. For James, it was both surprising and overwhelming. He realized that his fight had grown beyond a personal story and had become a matter of public importance. "This story isn't just about my experience," James said in the video. "It's about what happens to thousands of people every day. It's about those whose voices aren't always heard, who face neglect, discrimination, and humiliation. We can't stay silent. We need to talk about this, and most importantly, we need to act to make sure this never happens again." The video triggered an avalanche of responses. People, inspired by his courage, began sharing their own stories in the comments. Stories of how they too had faced injustice and felt powerless in the face of discrimination. It was as if long-suppressed wounds were being reopened. Each message was filled with pain, but also with hope. James saw how his words were helping others find strength and determination not to remain silent. Meanwhile, beyond the video, James continued working on the training program. They decided that each session would be interactive. Restaurant staff wouldn't just listen to lectures, but would also participate in discussions and role-playing scenarios to practically understand how to deal with bias and conflicts. James personally suggested several scenarios for these role-plays, based on real-life situations that people encounter in everyday life. When everything was ready, James felt that they had achieved an important milestone. He saw that the franchise owner was genuinely invested, and all the promised measures were being implemented. However, one important moment still lay ahead: the return to the restaurant. James knew that this meeting would be a symbolic act, important not just for him, but for everyone who had followed his story. Throughout the week, despite the intense work, James continued to receive unwavering support from his family and the community. Sarah, his wife, was by his side every step of the way, providing emotional support. Monica continued promoting his video, working with activists and helping organize public discussions. The community that had supported James from the beginning remained strong. People wrote to him, shared news, and organized rallies and flash mobs in his support. All these actions reinforced James's belief that he was doing the right thing. He no longer felt alone. He realized that his story had touched the hearts of many, and that gave him the strength to keep going. The day finally arrived when the training program was ready to be launched, and James's return to the restaurant was scheduled. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but he also knew that this step was crucial for making his story a lasting example of how to fight discrimination and injustice. The long-awaited day of James's return to the restaurant had arrived, the very place where this whole story had begun. This was not just a visit, but a key moment in his personal fight for justice, a moment that symbolized change. Over the past few weeks, his story had gained significant attention, and now many people, including the media and activists, were watching his every move. James knew that this day would be a real test. Not only would he confront the past, but he would also help lay the groundwork for future change. From early morning, James felt a sense of nervous tension. He prepared for the day with his family, receiving words of support from his wife and children. They had been by his side from the beginning, and now their presence gave him strength. Monica had suggested organizing a small rally in front of the restaurant to draw public attention to the event, but James preferred to keep the visit as a formal meeting. He wanted this day to focus on constructive changes, not protests. When James arrived at the restaurant, he was greeted by cameras from journalists and a small group of activists who had gathered nearby to show their support. People holding signs with slogans like "No to discrimination" and "Equality for all" cheered as James stepped out of his car. He felt a wave of nervous excitement. This was more than he had imagined just a few weeks ago. The story had grown into something far bigger than he had expected. Together with the franchise owner, they entered the restaurant. James noticed that the place was nearly full, but all eyes were on them. People sitting at tables paused, watching intently, trying to figure out what would happen next. The restaurant staff, already aware of the visit, glanced nervously in their direction. Some looked worried, while others seemed embarrassed. It was clear that it wasn't easy for them to realize that one of the most widely discussed cases of discrimination in the city had occurred in their establishment. The franchise owner approached the reception desk and signaled for attention. His voice was confident, but the seriousness of the moment was evident in his eyes. "Today, we are here to acknowledge the mistakes that were made and to discuss the important changes we are implementing," he began, addressing the staff. "This restaurant, like all our establishments, should be a place where every customer feels respected and valued. We are introducing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and starting today, all employees will undergo special training on inclusivity and respect for every customer." James stood beside the owner, watching the staff's reactions. Some looked confused, realizing that this situation had gone beyond a simple workplace conflict. The manager who had refused to serve James last time stood off to the side, his head lowered, avoiding eye contact. It was clear that this situation had become a serious lesson for him. Other employees, on the other hand, seemed more positive. Perhaps they understood that these changes were long overdue and would improve the work environment. The owner continued, "Today, James is with us, a person whose story has become an important milestone in our pursuit of change. His courage and determination to speak out have helped us see our weaknesses and take action. We want to thank him for that and assure him that from this moment on, incidents like this will no longer occur in our establishments." After these words, the owner invited James to say a few words. Despite his nervousness, James knew that this moment was important, not only for him, but for everyone who had followed his story. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I didn't expect my story to receive this much attention," he began. "When I came here that day, I just wanted to have dinner, like any other customer. But instead, I was faced with an injustice that I couldn't ignore. I thought about how to react for a long time, and at first, I wanted to just walk away. But then I realized that staying silent wouldn't help. I'm grateful to everyone who has supported me on this journey." His voice wavered slightly, but he continued. "I'm not here to place blame. I'm here to say that we can change. This restaurant can become a place where everyone feels like a welcome guest, but this requires work. Work on ourselves and our biases. I believe we can do it." After his words, a heavy silence filled the room. It was a powerful speech, filled with honesty and a willingness to engage in dialogue. James knew his words resonated not only with the restaurant employees, but also with everyone who fights against discrimination every day. He felt that he had taken the first step toward real change. When his speech ended, the franchise owner took the floor again and announced the new measures that would be implemented in the restaurant. In addition to mandatory employee training, new rules would be put in place to ensure respect for every guest, regardless of their appearance, nationality, or social status. Informational materials about equality and inclusivity would be displayed in the restaurant, so that every customer would know they were welcome here. Despite their initial anxiety, the staff expressed their support for the changes. They understood that these adjustments were necessary, and that the incident with James had opened their eyes to issues that had long been ignored. As the meeting concluded, James felt the tension he had carried all morning begin to fade. He knew there was still much work to be done, but this step was crucial. He had returned to the restaurant not just as a customer, but as someone who had initiated real change. He had succeeded not only in seeking justice for himself, but in helping many others. As he exited the restaurant, he was greeted by applause from the activists and journalists outside. James smiled. He knew he had made the right decision. His story had become more than just a personal battle. It had become a symbol of the change that can happen when people are not afraid to speak out against injustice and fight for their rights. After the official speeches and announcements in the restaurant, the most tense moment of the meeting arrived. The confrontation with the manager who had refused to serve James on that fateful day. This man had become the center of the scandal, and now he would have to explain his actions, not just to the franchise owner and James, but to an audience that included employees, media representatives, and activists gathered in the restaurant. The manager stood off to the side, clearly nervous. His face was filled with anxiety and embarrassment. He understood that today he would have to answer for his actions. Over the past few weeks, he had become a symbol of discrimination and bias, a spotlight he had never anticipated. When he was called forward, all eyes in the room immediately focused on him. He knew there was no avoiding responsibility. The franchise owner gave him the floor, and the manager reluctantly stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly, and it was evident that he felt unsure of himself. "I want to start by apologizing," the manager began, avoiding eye contact with James. "On that day, I misinterpreted the restaurant's rules. I thought I was acting within the establishment standards when I refused to serve you. But now, I understand that I made a mistake. I didn't mean to offend anyone." He paused, searching for the right words. But the room was filled with tense silence. His words didn't sound convincing, and many people could sense that. His explanation seemed more like an attempt to justify his actions, rather than a genuine admission of guilt. James, who had been listening carefully to every word, knew that the issue went far beyond the misinterpretation of the rules. This was a matter of bias and lack of respect for others, and he was determined to address it. The manager continued, trying to explain his actions. "The restaurant was busy that day, and I thought it would be better not to accept new guests without a reservation. I regret how things turned out, and I realize I should have acted differently." Sensing his patience wearing thin, James decided to cut through the manager's evasions. He stepped forward, looking directly at the manager, and spoke in a firm and confident voice. "It wasn't about the rules," James began, his voice breaking the tense silence in the room. "And you know that. There were empty tables in the restaurant that day. I saw them myself. It wasn't about me not having a reservation, or the restaurant being too crowded. You refused me because you saw me as a problem you chose not to deal with." The manager froze, unable to hide behind the rules any longer. James had directly pointed out the real reason for the refusal. As James continued speaking, his voice grew stronger. "You didn't want to see me in that restaurant for reasons that had nothing to do with reservations or how busy the place was. You judged me based on my appearance, on who I was, rather than as a customer who just wanted to have dinner. That's called bias. And the issue isn't just about what you did back then. It's that even now, you don't want to admit that it wasn't a mistake, but an act of discrimination." A heavy silence settled over the room. All eyes were on James and the manager. Many people, perhaps for the first time, were beginning to reflect on how often bias shaped their own decisions and actions. James wasn't just speaking about his personal experience. He was addressing a larger issue that affected many. The manager looked lost. His attempts to justify his actions had crumbled under the weight of James's words. He realized that simple apologies wouldn't change how people viewed this incident. His actions had had far-reaching consequences. The manager tried to say something, but his words were a weak echo of self-defense. Without waiting for his response, James continued, "I'm not here to demand apologies. They won't change anything now. I'm here for change. You can apologize as much as you want, but if you don't change your attitude, it won't make a difference. You need to understand that discrimination isn't a mistake. It's a choice. And you made that choice back then. But you have the opportunity now to make a different choice, to acknowledge that it wasn't just a mistake, but a bias, and that you're ready to change." Those words silenced everyone. The importance of the meeting lay not just in rehashing the past, but in offering a path forward. James knew that such conversations were always difficult, but without them, progress would be impossible. The manager finally met James's gaze. His face was pale, and it was clear that James's words had struck deep. He lowered his head, realizing he could no longer hide behind excuses. This was a moment of reckoning, for him and for everyone present. "You're right," the manager said quietly, struggling to find the right words. "I was biased, and I regret that. I realize now that my actions caused harm, and I'm ready to learn and change." His admission, though late, felt sincere. This moment was a lesson not only for the manager, but for the entire restaurant staff, and for those who had followed James's story. Acknowledging one's mistakes is the first step toward change, but actions must follow. The franchise owner standing beside him emphasized that the manager would undergo additional training, as would all the restaurant staff. He promised that such incidents would not happen again, and that the zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination would be a core value of their business moving forward. For James, this was a crucial moment. The confrontation with the manager showed that change was possible, but it required recognizing one's mistakes and a willingness to transform. This lesson was important for everyone present, and James knew that his fight had brought about real results. The confrontation with the manager had been a challenging but necessary step. As the tension in the room began to ease, a sense of anticipation lingered. Everyone knew this was not the end. A decisive move from the franchise owner was expected, and it came without delay. The franchise owner stood before the audience, taking a deep breath as he picked up the microphone. His face was serious, and it was clear that his forthcoming announcement would mark a pivotal moment, not just for this restaurant, but for the entire chain. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, glancing at the restaurant staff and the activists gathered in support. "Today, we have witnessed how our system has failed. We've heard how discrimination, bias, and disrespect can destroy the trust in our business and our values. This is not what I built my company on, and today, we must take drastic measures to correct this." The room went silent, waiting for his next words. "I have made the decision to temporarily close this restaurant for a complete review of its operations. This is not just a symbolic action. We will keep the doors closed until every employee, from managers to kitchen staff, has completed mandatory training on inclusivity, equality, and respect. This restaurant will only reopen when I am fully confident that every customer, regardless of their race, background, gender, or social status, will be treated here with respect and dignity." These words were met with loud applause from those present. Human rights advocates, activists, and community members who had come to support James stood up, expressing their approval. Many of them had been fighting for such changes for years, and this decision represented a significant step in the right direction. Standing next to the franchise owner, James felt a mixture of relief and pride. This was the moment he realized his story had achieved what once seemed impossible. What began as a simple refusal of service had led to significant changes in the company, and now the restaurant would not be able to return to business until its very culture was transformed. For James, this was proof that his efforts had resulted in real, meaningful progress. The owner continued, "We will also be reviewing our corporate standards to ensure that a zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination is enforced across all our restaurants. This will become part of our company culture. We will make sure that every employee knows and understands that every customer deserves respect. And this will not just be a training. This will become part of our everyday practice. This announcement marked a turning point for the entire restaurant chain. The temporary closure of one of their establishments signaled a significant financial loss, but the owner made it clear that the company's reputation and values were more important than immediate profits. He was willing to sacrifice revenue to correct mistakes and restore the community's trust. For James, this was a deeply rewarding moment. His story had become not just a personal journey for justice, but a catalyst for real change in the company. He knew that this decision would affect not only this restaurant, but also serve as a lesson for the entire industry. His voice had sparked change, and this was a tremendous victory, not only for him, but for everyone who had faced injustice. When the owner finished his speech, he approached James and extended his hand. "Thank you for not staying silent," he said. "You've helped us see our mistakes and steer the company in the right direction." James shook his hand and, looking him in the eyes, replied, "I hope this is the beginning of bigger changes, not just here but everywhere where similar issues occur." They stood surrounded by people who supported their efforts. For James, it was an emotional moment. He realized that his story had become part of something much larger. He felt the support of those around him and was grateful to everyone who had helped him along this path. Then, the franchise owner invited the media to ask questions, and journalists began discussing the details of the upcoming closure and training. The decision was widely covered in the press, and news of the restaurant's temporary shutdown quickly spread across social media and news outlets. People praised the owner's decision, seeing it as a sign that fighting against injustice was not only possible, but necessary. For James, this was a significant day. He stood outside the restaurant, looking at the doors that would soon close for a thorough reassessment of how the business operated. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but only the beginning. But now he knew that his efforts could lead to real results. It was a major accomplishment for him personally, and for the entire community that had supported him every step of the way. The restaurant was closing, but this wasn't just an act of shutting down a business. It was the opening of a new path, a path toward respect, justice, and inclusivity. After the public announcement about the temporary closure of the restaurant for mandatory training and policy revisions, attention to James's story intensified dramatically. The events surrounding his fight for justice became the center of discussions in the media, on social networks, and in public forums. This was the moment when James's personal experience transformed into a symbol of the broader fight against discrimination, becoming part of the discourse on equality and human rights. A video of his return to the restaurant, where he gave his speech and the franchise owner announced radical measures, quickly went viral online. The video captured key moments: James's determination, his confidence in the need for change, and the owner's promise to implement a zero-tolerance policy against discrimination. People who saw the video began sharing it widely on social media, adding hashtags like #SupportJames, #NoToDiscrimination, and #EqualRights. The response was so strong that James's story transcended the local level. Journalists from various parts of the country began writing articles discussing not only the restaurant incident, but also broader issues of discrimination and bias in the service industry. Major news channels conducted interviews with James, the franchise owner, and representatives of human rights organizations to explore potential solutions to these problems. Each new mention of his story in the media drew the attention of more people. The public was stirred. Many shared their own personal stories of discrimination they had experienced in cafes, restaurants, stores, and other public places. Social media became a platform for discussion, where people wrote posts about their experiences, tagging them with hashtags inspired by James's story. Under these posts, debates emerged about how everyday discrimination manifests in society and how to combat it. Human rights organizations and activists were particularly proactive. They launched campaigns to raise awareness about discrimination in the service sector, organizing roundtable discussions and webinars to discuss how anti-discrimination measures could be effectively implemented in various companies. James received numerous invitations from activist groups. He was asked to speak at conferences, share his story, and highlight the importance of standing against bias and inequality. Journalists constantly sought new opportunities to interview James to get his comments on the ongoing coverage of his case. One of the country's largest national publications released a comprehensive article discussing how his case became a catalyst for changes in the service industry and how social media can play a key role in exposing and preventing such incidents. A key aspect highlighted in the media was the power of an individual voice and its impact on societal change. James became a symbol of how anyone who faces injustice can be heard if they have the courage to tell their story. The media emphasized that it was James's determination to speak about his experience and challenge discrimination that played a crucial role in ensuring the story wasn't overlooked. His voice led to significant changes within the company and inspired thousands of people across the country. One major news channel aired a special segment dedicated to discrimination in the service industry, where experts and activists discussed how systemic bias infiltrates various aspects of life. They used James's story as an example of how such cases shouldn't be ignored. They require not only public condemnation, but also changes at the corporate and legal levels. James's story made people feel that they were not alone in their fight against discrimination. Social media saw the appearance of dozens, if not hundreds, of posts with personal stories where people shared how they had faced unfair treatment based on race, gender, or background. These posts were accompanied by comments of support, and many expressed that thanks to James, they felt empowered to speak up about their own experiences. Hashtags like #SupportJames and #NoToDiscrimination became symbols of this new wave of activism. People united, discussing what could be done to combat bias, and even organized flash mobs to draw attention to the problem of discrimination in the service industry. Some large restaurant and cafe chains, observing the resonance of James's story, began reviewing their internal policies and implementing training programs for employees to prevent such situations in the future. For James himself, this was an incredible experience. He never expected that his story would receive such a response and was deeply moved by the number of people who were ready to support him and share their own stories. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to all those who were inspired by his example and continued to participate in discussions, giving interviews and speaking at public events. One of the most significant moments for James came when he was invited to speak at a national human rights conference. He shared his story with a large audience, emphasizing how important it is not to remain silent in the face of injustice. His speech was met with thunderous applause, and many attendees approached him afterward to personally thank him for his courage. James's story became an important example of how even a single voice can become a catalyst for change. He proved that fighting for justice is both necessary and possible, and that public support can help break down barriers that many thought were insurmountable. Thanks to the media coverage of his story, people across the country, and perhaps beyond, began to reconsider how important it is to speak out against discrimination and inequality, and realize that every person, regardless of their position, can become a voice for change. James felt how this experience had transformed him. What had begun with humiliation and a sense of defeat had now turned into a source of pride and strength. His voice had been heard, and he realized that his fight mattered not just for him, but for many others. James became more confident in himself, actively participating in his community and helping others fight against injustice. His journey from feeling powerless to empowered gave him a new sense of purpose, motivating him to continue speaking up for those who were often silenced. James's story became a catalyst for real change. The franchise owner implemented a training program across the entire restaurant chain aimed at tackling bias and discrimination. James became an active participant in this program, helping train others and sharing his personal experience. His struggle had led to concrete results, and it brought him a sense of inner peace and hope. The community continued to support him, and together they believed they could make the world a better place. James's transformation symbolized not only his own victory, but also the collective power to inspire change.